Welcome to the Relational Recovery Podcast. I'm your host, Wes Thompson, joined by my co-host, Austin Hill. Today we're talking about trust and life mapping. So we hope this conversation is helpful, and thanks for listening. Good morning, Austin.
Good morning, Wes. How's it going?
It's going well. Nice, brisk Thursday morning. I want to talk about, today we're going to talk about trust. We just had a conversation with our staff and with Rich and Cliff from Crosspoint yesterday. And a lot of it was about trust and how so much of our sense of self as human beings is rooted and built upon a foundation of trust. Our ability to trust appropriately or not has so much to do with how we relate to everything else in the world, the people in our lives, the jobs in which we work, and honestly, like the manner in which we flourish or not. It's a lot of that is rooted in trust. And so life mapping will probably come up. For those of you that might not know what that is, we'll define that. But some of you probably do. And then attachment, like how do we attach to other people, is rooted in trust. So this is important. And I think that, it's something we've talked about here on the podcast. It's something that we talk about amongst the staff at the Refuge a lot, because our ability to trust is monumental in the quality of the life that we will have. Because the reality is that early on, so many of us experienced, I'll just say it this way, difficult things or relationships that maybe were meant to be a certain way and weren't. Particularly, I think of the cliche of if my parents didn't show up the way that they were supposed to show up, I'm going to be injured in such a way, or that the way I see other people is going to be impacted by the manner in which my parents treated me. And so if that relationship wasn't necessarily good, or maybe you didn't have parents, maybe you grew up as an orphan, or maybe you grew up in a home where mom and dad weren't consistently showing up, or one of them wasn't present at all, that impacts the way that we trust future leaders and people in our lives. And that's significant, because that impacts our quality of life. That impacts the way that we move and act and live in the world, and what we ultimately deem as being appropriate and inappropriate and good and bad and so on and so forth. So, we'll just kind of bounce around this complex and important idea today. But before we get too far, anything you want to say as kind of a means of introduction, or any thoughts on the top of your head?
I think identifying why trust is so important, like connecting it to, it's something that we think about almost all the time. Like it's what we're naturally doing. We're gauging whether we're safe. Like our bodies do that all the time. We're constantly scanning our environment, the people around us, is, are we safe? And you can gauge how safe you are with someone based on how much you can or cannot trust them, or how much you can or cannot trust yourself. So it is foundational to how you just interact and relate to the world. The statement that we use a lot, that we have heard from our mentors, a lot of guys at Crosspoint talk about the quality of your life depends on the quality of your relationships, and the quality of your relationships depend on your capacity for trust. And it's not just trust in other people, it's trust in yourself. So it is something that is constantly impacting how you experience the world, how you make decisions, how you identify relationships, and how you build them or disregard them. So this is a major foundational topic, and it's really big. And why we think it's important to talk about your story is because if you can figure out where the deficiencies or integrity gaps are in your trust, you'll be able to address them a lot better. it's easier to solve a problem if you know what the problem is coming from. Because it's one thing to be like, man, I'm just really distrustful. That's just who I am. It's like, it's like, I'm just going to figure out how, I'm just going to try to trust people more. It would be really good if you knew where that came from so you can anticipate it and be intentional in building a healthier trust. So there's a lot of fear that comes with looking into our stories in the past, or like, it seems kind of pointless. Like, the past is the past. I'm not going to let it affect my future. That sounds nice. And it can be true. Like, you can say, like, I know the way you don't let the past affect your future is you own your story, which is the past. That's how you can move forward. But if you don't know your story, it's always, always going to impact your present and your future. So you have to own it. You have to be able to clearly tell your story with honesty. That's not like a doom and gloom story, but it's also not like a rose-colored, everything was great story. It's an honest story. So this is scary, important work. And you mentioned life mapping. So I can just from that statement alone, I can see and hear how complicated trust becomes. It's not just like, oh, trust people. There's so much behind it. And I think that's why it's important we're talking about it.
Yeah. Well, we'll start with why is trust so important? Because you said a lot of several things there, but that was one of them. I think, this might be a duh statement, but trust is important because I've heard it said it's the currency of relationships. Which, if you're like, what does that mean? Well, if you don't have trust, you don't have anything with someone else. That's why when, just to use like an example of a marriage relationship, when there's infidelity, it can be so tough because trust is broken. And if you can't trust this person that you've committed to spend your life with and make all these major decisions together with, possibly have children with, so on and so forth, if you can't trust that person, then it's hard to really do much else. In other words, if you don't have trust, you don't have anything. Like, that's the root. That's the foundation of relationships. So that's one way trust is important. I think there's so many ways. I'm not going to try to unpack all of them, but I think you brought up an interesting thought when the question, am I safe, is rooted in trust. Can I trust this other person? Anytime I feel unsafe or I'm unsure if I'm safe, it's because I'm in an environment or with a people or with a person that I'm not sure I can trust. If you go to a neighborhood you're not familiar with and you're by yourself or something, that sense of anxiety that might come up in you is an issue of trust. I don't trust my surroundings. Maybe it's because you just don't know. But again, that's rooted in trust. If you're with someone that you feel unsafe with, it's because you don't trust them. So even to your point, Austin, the issue of safety is really rooted in the issue of trust. Can I trust where I am, who I'm with, what I'm doing, so on and so forth. Maybe you work at a job. People start to feel unsafe. Maybe it's because they have a boss they don't trust, or maybe the company they feel like is going under and they don't trust the security of their future. Again, that sense of safety is rooted in trust.
Yeah. And it's interesting. If you don't feel safe, there are multiple responses that you can have, and it's figuring out like what are some practical ways where, like, if I don't feel safe or I don't trust this person or I don't trust myself, like what are there's a handful of practical ways to start taking steps towards figuring out, can I trust them? And you mentioned one, if you go to a new neighborhood and you don't feel comfortable or safe, like it's learning about the neighborhood, learning about the people, being curious and having an attitude of curiosity and willingness to be taught about something. Because I always, in certain situations, it's good. It's really, I believe that it's hard to be scared of people that you know personally. It's harder to be scared of them, because it's one thing just like if you're just scared of everybody you don't know, like that sounds exhausting to me. Like that means I have to know everybody to figure out if I'm safe or not. Like there's only so many people that you can get to know. And if you're in a neighborhood that you're not familiar with, like that uncomfortable feeling is because you don't know it yet. And it's the choice can be, well, I'm never going to go back, which limits our capacity for trust. Or I can be like, I'm going to stick to it and figure out these new things and get more and more comfortable in a neighborhood and be more and more familiar. And so I'm trusting it more, trusting the area more. And then from a smaller, like person to person way, it's the first time you meet somebody, you're going to feel uncomfortable. And that is because you don't know how much you can or can't trust them. And we've talked about this before. It's building trust doesn't mean that you're just like exposing everything right away. We believe in authenticity here, but you can authentically share parts of who you are with everybody, but it's being able to identify the appropriate things to share right away, like your name, your interests, why you're here. Like those are good, like just steps to see, like what are similar interests, those type of things. It's not like sharing your deepest, darkest secrets and your bank account information and how much money you have in your wallet with every stranger you see on the street. Like, do you see there's different levels to this? And why it's important to know your stories, if you come from and have a history, honest history of constantly being lied to, constantly being abandoned, it's going to be hard to trust people. So it's the practice. And then on the flip side of that, if you came from a place where you were very sheltered or protected and it seemed like you lived in a world where everybody had your best interest in mind or everybody removed all consequences, of course you're going to trust people. Like it's like, oh, yeah, everything's going to work. Everything has worked out for me. So why shouldn't I trust people? Why shouldn't I, think that things are going to end well, which is not honest. Like if we think about it, our job as parents, our job in relationships is to let consequences hit the people that they need to hit, which another way we like that you talk about a lot is letting put the tension where it belongs, which means if someone makes a mistake, they're going to have to deal with the consequences. That doesn't mean they have to deal with them alone, but so there's both sides of this trust factor where we can not trust people too much, like we can be really distrustful. And then there's someone who is too trusting on the other side where it's just like, I'm just living in a fantasy where everything is going to work out and there's no consequences. Like neither of those are good or healthy. So we need to find like, what is that middle ground? And that's why we need each other, because the distrustful person needs to grow in trust. And the person who is living in a fantasy that just like opens themselves up to all this crap needs to have more discernment, needs to slow down. So, and you practice that with each other.
Yeah, that's good. Well, let's think about how trust relates to life mapping for a moment, because life mapping is something that we try to do consistently at the refuge, which is a really simple and yet difficult but powerful tool. The first question I want to ask, just for all of us, right? Anyone listening, but just to kind of set this up, is just to ponder, what did my caregivers, in other words, what did nurture look like for me growing up? When I was a young person, what was my household like? What were the parents like? What was school like? What did my nature and nurture look like growing up?
No, that's a big question.
Yeah, and the reason that we ask it is because that, whatever that looked like for you and for me, it set us up. It set the stage for how we relate right now. Whatever the early stuff, whatever that was like, that set the stage for how we relate with other people and with God and everything else. It set the stage for how we relate later in life. So, how you see other people and how I see other people and how we interact has so much to do with how the people that we trusted or that we were supposed to trust early, how they showed up for us and to us. So it's important to kind of just ponder and start there and wonder and think, what was that like? And so I'll get into kind of the nuts and bolts for a second, and then, you can chime in. But when we talk about life map, we're essentially talking about memory. We're talking about what are the events that took place that stand out to you in your life. The time that I did this really intensively, it was interesting that when I was in seminary, I had a class. They didn't call it life mapping, but we essentially did life mapping. And what I did was I wrote down all the memories I could think of on all these different Post-it notes. Because the goal at first was just what happened. Essentially, you think about your life and you answer the question, what happened? And a lot of memories come up. And so the first thing I did was just write each memory on kind of a Post-it note. So just the summary, very short, and just put it on the wall. I wrote down all these memories that I could just, again, I wasn't thinking about it from beginning to end at that point. I was just, whatever came up, I wrote it down and I stuck it on the wall. After I wrote down every memory that came to mind, and just on top of my consciousness, I started to order them. I started to take those Post-it notes and order them from earliest to most recent. And then I started to ask myself, because again, I'm just listing the events at this point. Is there anything missing? Are there any gaps in memory? Like, are there a lot of memories at a certain spot, but there's no memories at another spot? Like, for example, maybe I've got a lot of memories at age like 8, but no memories at age 6 or no memories at age 14. That's interesting. So, like, what can I remember what happened in those ages? And I'm just kind of I'm not judging at this point. I'm just trying to write out what happened. Well, what happened in my life? And then the second step, and this isn't really what we did in seminary, but this is what we do at the refuge. And the second step is how did it make me feel? When I think about these memories, what are the emotions associated with them?
Yeah, specifically, how did it make you feel? Not how it makes you feel now, how it made you feel in that moment. Trying to look back into that. Well, they are, but they're different steps. Yeah, they're different steps.
Yeah. How did I feel when I was 14 and so happened? What did it make me feel? So I listed the event, but the second step is really thinking about connecting it to my body, connecting it to really reflecting on how did this impact me? And then the third step is like, we call it the interpretation, but what does that mean? What did I tell myself, or what did I believe as a result of that event and that feeling? What did I believe? What did I tell myself? What did I vow to myself? Well, how did it change the way that I see the world? And to use a negative example, how often this shows up is, let's just say you were, in your early teens and something happened to you that was painful. And so this painful thing happened. The emotion obviously is like some level of, maybe it was pain, or maybe there was sadness associated, maybe there was anger associated with the pain. And maybe you told yourself, I'm never going to put myself in a situation to experience something like this again. So my belief is, I'm not ever going to make myself vulnerable in this way ever again. And because I can't trust so and so. And so again, just giving kind of this quick made up example, those kinds of events, emotions, and interpretations or beliefs impact the way we show up later in life, and ultimately keep us distanced from parts of ourselves, but really also keep us distanced from other people. Unless we grew up in a perfect, stable, and secure environment, which is unfortunately rare. So this kind of reflection, it takes just that. It takes reflection. It takes time. It takes intentionality, to where we have to sit down. We have to list the events. We have to list the emotions. We have to list the beliefs. And what we're trying to do is really ask ourselves, like, okay, what happened to me? What happened to me? How did I get here? It's so important to tell your story, because that's what you're doing when you tell your story. You're kind of noticing, like, how did I get here? How do I get here? Because if I don't know how I got here, especially if there's a lot of dysfunction, if I don't know how I got here, it can be tough to know where to go from here. But also it can be tough because even if I make some major changes, we tend to default into habitual behavior. And so if I don't know how I got here, there's a good chance I can go back to that place and not realize I'm doing it. So the work of life mapping is important for that reason. So I'll pause there. Is there anything do you want to add or take away or nuance to that?
A few things. The processes, there are, like, just like in anything, there's multiple ways to accomplish this. And you listed one where you wrote down memories on a Post-it note and then put them in chronological order or a timeline. Like that's a great way to do it. It's because, like, we all think and process differently. There isn't like there are, things that we want to be honest, but how we get to our story, there are multiple ways. And some people are like, just like the idea, like if you were to ask me, Wes, a couple of years ago, it's like, well, describe your childhood. I'm like, honestly, it was really good. Lots of it were really good. My parents came, were present. They were a big part of my life. They loved me imperfectly because they are not perfect people. And because they loved me imperfectly, it affected me in different ways. A lot of positive, a lot of negative. That's normal. But for it to be with people who grow up in a very stable household, I can confidently say that mine was pretty stable. And when that happens, that means I can be dishonest about, well, it was really good compared to a lot of the people I know. So I'm just not going to look into it. That's not being honest. That's one way to look at it. So a way to think about what was it like, the nurture side of your life, a really practical way to see what it was actually like is write out and say, or if you're wanting to gain clarity, write out and think about what it looked like getting ready for school in the morning. Who was there? Who helped? Like, did you wake up on your own? Were you woken up by your parents? Did you wake up on time? Did you get to school on time? Did they make your lunch? Did you make your lunch? Did you have to make your own breakfast? Was there breakfast? Was there food in the house? Did they get you to the school bus? Did you have to walk to school? Were you dropped off by your parents? all these different details add clarity to how you grew up. And you can do it for elementary school, middle school, high school. And then like the question, like, did you finish high school? Why not? What happened? That's one way to start adding clarity to what happened to you. And this isn't like an accusatory or like a like you were like convicting or judging your story. Don't look at this as like, I'm judging my story. It's like, I'm just wanting to get the facts. What happened? I'm trying to get a good, honest narration of my story. Now, if that process, you're like, I have no idea, I cannot remember. Something that you could do. Another step is, for lack of a better term, body mapping. And what that does is just this one's. I like this one because it's really simple. You write down like on a piece of paper, one like just like a line paper, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, all the way to 20. And then as like, you're not going to remember age. Well, some people might remember the young ages, but like, how did you what was a major thing that you experienced with your body at each of those ages? Now, that could be like when I was 14, I got in a car wreck because that affected, like I was in the hospital. I didn't, I'm just giving examples. Like when you were 12, you smoked your first cigarette. When you were 17, you lost your virginity. When you were 8 was the first time you got in a physical fight with someone who wasn't in your family. When 6, it was the first time you got abused by someone physically. So like putting those things into place and then taking that information and lining it up with those events or memories that you were talking about, Wes, you can start connecting some dots. You're like, when I was 11, like this is an example, it's not from my story, but this is how this can work is you look at, when I was 11, I started drinking. When I was 10, I know we moved and I was really angry at my parents. There might be a correlation between those two events. And that's what we're looking for is clarity around what happened to you, good and bad. So and then the next part is that question of what happened to you is a question that we have been trying to answer for a very long time. Like biblically, and there's Paul says this great thing about like, I know the things I don't want to do, and yet I still do them. Getting clarity around our story helps answer maybe parts of why you do the things you don't want to do. And that's why this work is important.
Yeah, I think when I think about trust and I think about everything that you're saying and everything we're talking about, there's just the reality that this kind of work, if it's done well, takes time. Because the reality, the painful but truthful reality, because life is painful. The truth for many of us is trust has been broken by things we've done and by things that have been done to us. And in order to build trust, trust is built by doing trustworthy things. As we often say, and we've heard, trust is built by doing trustworthy things. But the second part of that is over time. And I think that's what can be really hard for people that have burnt a lot of bridges. That's why it's important to really pay attention before we act, because when we burn down the bridges of trust, it takes time to rebuild those. I'll give you an example. I had an alumni of the Refuge talk to me. This was probably, 4 months ago or so. And this is a common story. This is something that we all feel. But, his daughter's mom, his daughter lives with her. And he's been trying to be very good to them over the last couple of years. Because in the past, because of his addiction, he wasn't present. And when he was inconsistent. And there was just a lot of distrust and pain and distance as a result. He just wasn't there. He wasn't there, and so on and so forth. And as he's gotten better, and as he's built his life around his faith and God, and so on and so forth, he's tried to repair that by doing things like helping them out financially, coming to where they are, and taking them out to grab food, and the things that you do when you're trying to build a relationship. And what happened when he reached out to me is he's like, man, I feel like I'm being taken advantage of because I've done all these things and I didn't do this one thing that they wanted me to do, and now my daughter's not talking to me. And I think that my daughter's mom is like poisoning her perspective of me. And you know what I think I'm going to do? I think I'm just going to stop helping them, and I'm just going to shut them out because. And I want to be sensitive here because I recognize like he was speaking from a place of hurt. But what I asked him was, okay, if you do that, how do you think that's going to go? And obviously it was some version of not good. And I'm like, well, what is it that you want? He's like, well, I want my daughter to talk to me. And I'm like, do you think that by acting out in that way that she's going to want to talk to you? No. Okay. The reason I tell this story, because there's more I could say about it. The reason I tell this story is just to point out, even when you start doing the right things, the road to building trust is again, one, by starting to do trustworthy things, but two, it takes time. It takes time. And, it can be frustrating because things weren't happening as quickly as this guy wanted them to. And so when things don't happen as quickly as we want them to, sometimes we want to throw in the towel and we want to quit. We just want to say, we feel entitled sometimes to, oh, well, I'm doing the right thing now, so you guys should appreciate that I've changed. But as we know, that's not how life works. That's not how life works. We have to be patient with ourselves, and we have to be patient with others.
And we also have to be honest, because sometimes we have broken trust so much that it cannot be rebuilt in this lifetime. And that really, really sucks. That's really hard to hear. But some of us need to hear that. And that's I believe in the redemptive power of working to build healthy relationships. But a relationship is a two-way street, and it has to be reciprocal in order for it to be a good relationship. And sometimes, for the health of yourself, you have to cut somebody off. Like if you're Joel there are real life examples I can think of where someone has to cut off a relationship with a parent because they are so toxic and so they're not good for you. And that's really painful. And that's what burning a bridge looks like. Like that person burnt the bridge. You didn't, but they did. And you have to put that boundary up. And at the same time, it might be true the other way, where you have broken trust so many times with somebody in your life that you care deeply about, that they decide not to have a relationship with you. And that sucks. But that is honest. But that sounds really it does suck. It's painful to think about that you may not have a relationship with somebody. And that does not mean that you cannot have fulfilled relationships with other people. Part of the consequence of breaking trust is that sometimes relationships end. And that it is very painful. And we do crazy things we go out of our way and do insane things to make sure that a relationship doesn't end. But sometimes they have to. But it's why they're scary is because somebody that you care for can decide not to be in a relationship with you and you have no control of it. That's scary. And that's why it's important to continually do those trustworthy things. Because if we think about it, what is in your control is how you choose to do or not do trustworthy things. And if someone doesn't trust you and you are doing trustworthy things, that is not on you. Like, you can only do what you can. So do trustworthy things.
You can choose to trust again. In other words, you can choose to trust again, but you can't force other people to trust.
Yep. And that is the painful but honest truth.
Yeah.
And if you are if you continually push yourself to be more trustworthy, to have more integrity, there will be stronger relationships for you. And just like you, the people around you that have cut you off, they can learn to trust again too. And it might happen with you. But don't cut off your ability or desire to trust because someone in your life decided not to trust you. Because you can't control if someone trusts you or not. You can control if you do trustworthy things, though. So focus on the thing that you can control. Don't let somebody else's bad choices impact you in a way where you do something dumb. You do something distrustful.
Yeah, that's really good. I think to kind of land the plane and bring this home, I think the hopeful thing here is I've seen it time and time again. Again, we don't want to give people like a false realistic expectation. Like you said, some things don't repair and it's outside of our control. But by and large, if you begin to do trustworthy things over time, when you put those two things together, doing trustworthy things, and the second thing, time, just for a long period of time, things do tend to repair. It will result in good things. Doesn't mean it's going to be perfect, but it means like that is a recipe though for your life, for your quality of life. To go back to the quote you said earlier, Austin, your quality of life will improve if you do trustworthy things over time.
Yeah. The over time part of that, it is one of my favorite things that I remember being told about how long will this take. It will take longer than you want. Like, just know that it's going to take longer than you want. So that means, so why are you doing these trustworthy things? It begs the question. Oh, I'm doing these trustworthy things. I'm only going to do it for a month. And if you don't trust me after a month, then I'm just giving up on trust. That doesn't make sense. I'm going to do trustworthy things for the people around me today. And then I'm going to go do it tomorrow. I'm going to do it the next day and the next day and the next day and the next day. And the quality of your relationships will improve that you are involved in. It will probably take more time to repair the relationships that are broken, that have deep, deep wounding, and it'll take a lot longer. And if you can let go of that part of it and just do what you know you can do, things will improve. It's just going to take longer than you think. But in that process, it's not wasted time. You are building healthier relationships with other people. And because I'm a hopeful person, and I always will be, no matter how much people I try to beat it out of myself, it's going to happen. You will have better relationships if you're working on being a more trustworthy person every day. It's just going to look different. But it's a good different.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Relational Recovery Podcast. We'll be back soon with a new conversation. We'll see you then.